Hi, my name is Julianna, and today Daniela and I will be talking about neurodiversity. Before we begin, we would just like to do a land acknowledgement, and this is for the Dish with One Spoon territory where Toronto and X University are located. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Now I'll go over our agenda for today, so I'll begin with an introduction along with some warning signs or symptoms. Then I'll be speaking about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, then autism spectrum disorder, learning disabilities, neurodiversity and sensory processing disorder, some statistics about neurodiversity, as well as the importance of neurodiversity and intersectionality. Then I'll pass it on to Daniela, who will speak about the medical model versus social model of disability, language, myths about neurodiversity, coping with neurodiversity, support tips for parents, as well as how to support a client, neurodiversity and strengths, some resources, as well as some important points to remember. In today's world, there is now a larger focus on one's brain differences instead of deficits. This wider view of normalcy is called neurodiversity, and advocates in this area hope to expand what we think of mental disorders. The term neurodiversity refers to the concept that certain developmental disorders are normal variations in the brain, and that these features also have certain strengths. As an example, individuals with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, may have trouble with time management, but they often show high levels of passion, drive, and creative thinking. Even something that is usually seen as undesirable, such as impulsivity, can be an advantage, as they will often say other things that people are afraid to say. It is important to note that neurodiversity is not the same as having a disability, though it is common for some individuals who have neurodivergent features to have accommodations at school or work. Neurodiversity commonly refers to people with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder or ASD, learning disabilities such as dyslexia or sensory processing difficulties, and more on the different types of neurodiversity will be explored in later slides. The following warning signs are usually present in children under 2 years old with neurodivergency. This includes poor eye contact, not smiling or social responsiveness, not responding to their name, fixation on lining up toys or objects or watching toys spin or move, repeating actions or sounds over and over, and having no two-word phrases by the age of 2 years old. Along with this, in older children and adults, they usually struggle with reading, writing, and math, are often clumsy, find it difficult to cope with large crowds, bright lights, loud or sudden noises, and social situations. They have difficulty keeping eye contact, have low social interaction and the inability to initiate or hold a conversation, as well as difficulty focusing or keeping still. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders in childhood. ADHD is often diagnosed in childhood and lasts until adulthood. However, sometimes ADHD can be missed or misdiagnosed in childhood and instead diagnosed in adulthood, but this is far less common. Children with ADHD often have trouble paying attention, controlling impulsive behaviors, or can be overly active. Symptoms in children include the following: losing or forgetting things a lot, squirming or fidgeting, talking too much, making careless mistakes or take unnecessary risks, have a hard time resisting temptation, having difficulty getting along with others or taking turns and sharing. There are 3 types of ADHD, depending upon which types of symptoms are strongest in the individual. First, there's predominantly inattentive presentation. For this, it is hard for the individual to organize or finish a task, to pay attention to details, or to follow instructions or conversations. They are also easily distracted and forget details of their daily routines. Next is predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation. People with this type of ADHD fidget and talk a lot, They find it hard to sit still for long. Smaller children may run, jump, or climb constantly. They feel restless and have trouble with impulsivity. It is hard for the person to wait their turn or to listen to directions. And people with impulsivity may have more accidents and injuries than others. Along with this, there is also combined presentation, which means the symptoms of the above two types are equally present in the person. ADHD is treatable. The first line of treatment is usually behavioral therapy well before medication is tried. However, some parents may choose to use both on their children. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a developmental disability that can cause significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges in individuals. More times than not, there is nothing about how an individual with ASD looks that makes them different from others, but instead the individual communicates, interacts, behaves, and learns differently than other people. ASD is a wide spectrum, and the learning, thinking, and problem-solving abilities of those with ASD can range from gifted to severely challenged. Along with this, some people with ASD need assistance with their daily lives and routines, while others need less or none at all. Nowadays, a diagnosis of ASD includes several conditions that once used to be diagnosed separately. These include autistic disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Asperger syndrome. Symptoms for children or adults with ASD include not pointing at objects to show interest or not looking at objects when another person points at them, having trouble relating to others or not having an interest in other people at all, avoiding eye contact and wanting to be alone, having difficulties understanding other people's feelings or talking about their own feelings, having trouble expressing their needs. They may also be very interested in people but not know how to talk, play, or relate to them. They may also prefer not to be held or cuddled. Before we begin talking about learning disabilities, it is important to note that having a learning disability is not the same thing as having ADHD or ASD. They do, however, fall under the same category of being neurodivergent. The main types of learning disabilities include dyspraxia, which affects a person's motor skills. Young children with dyspraxia may bump into things or have trouble holding utensils or tying their shoes. They may also struggle with writing and typing. They can also have speech difficulties, sensitivity to light, touch, taste, and smell, and difficulty with eye movements. Next is dyslexia, which affects how a person processes language and can often make reading and writing difficult. This can cause problems with grammar, spelling, and reading comprehension. Children may have trouble expressing themselves or putting their thoughts together during conversations. Then there's dysgraphia, which affects a person's writing abilities. It can also include a variety of different problems, such as bad handwriting, trouble with spelling, and difficulty putting thoughts onto paper. Lastly is dyscalculia, which affects a person's ability to do math and can have different symptoms from person to person. In young children, they may have difficulty counting and recognizing numbers, hindering their ability to learn. And as they get older, they may also have trouble solving basic math problems or memorizing things like the application tables. It is important to recognize the early signs of learning disabilities so parents can get their child the help they need as soon as possible. It is important to recognize your child's developmental milestones, as these milestones can be large indicators for if your child is on track with their learning. For example, delays such as late walking or talking or trouble with socialization can be early signs of a learning disorder in toddlers. Special education is the most common treatment for learning disabilities. After an evaluation focused on where a child is having difficulties learning, special educators will create an individualized education program, or IEP, that outlines what special services the child needs to thrive in school and their learning and build on their strengths. Individuals with a type of neurodiversity also often have a type of sensory processing difficulty. There are two different types: auditory processing disorder and visual processing disorder. Auditory processing disorder is a disorder that affects the way the brain processes sound. However, it is not caused by hearing impairment. Individuals with this disorder may experience the following: difficulty learning to read, unable to distinguish sounds from background noises, difficulty following spoken instructions, difficulty telling the difference between similar sounding words, and difficulty remembering things they've heard. Visual processing disorder is a disorder that affects the way an individual interprets visual information. Individuals with this type of processing disorder may have a hard time with the following tasks: reading, telling the difference between two similar objects, and trouble with hand-eye coordination. Now we'll just quickly go over some statistics. Between 40 and 30% of the population is thought to be neurodivergent, while the majority are called neurotypical. Neurodiversity is 3 times more likely to affect males rather than females. At least 1 in 3 individuals with autism experience severe mental health difficulties due to a lack of support, either from those around them or from social services, and it is estimated that between 44 and 52% of individuals with ASD may also have a learning disability. Lastly, it's important to talk about neurodiversity and intersectionality, as this is a big subject in disability studies. As you may remember from a previous video, intersectionality is used to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Intersectionality is an important aspect to disability studies and is used as an analytical tool to bridge and build upon different connections. For example, being an individual of color with a disability or being a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community and also having a disability. Neurodiversity is often associated with being a hidden disability. However, this contributes to the lack of recognition of neurodiversity along with feelings of marginalization and oppression. This in turn contributes to stereotypes and feeling ashamed of one's diagnosis. Intersectionality in disability studies focuses on moving away from these stereotypes, myths, misinformation, and biases, and instead encourages more open conversations through the social model of disability that Daniela will speak about next.
Also important to this discussion is a quick review of the medical model and the social model of disability, as they will be mentioned a couple of times throughout the presentation. The medical model of disability states that disability is caused by impairments and differences. It focuses on what is perceived as wrong. Thus, these differences should be fixed through medical interventions. This leads to a lack of self-determination, independence, and control. On the other hand, the social model of disability states that disability is a result of how society is organized and the attitudes of others. Therefore, it's society that is inherently inaccessible to disabled people. It focuses on lessening the barriers to make society more accessible so that equity can be achieved. This creates more control and self-determination in an individual's life. Now we'll discuss a bit about language. Language plays an important role in perpetuating stereotypes or deconstructing and challenging them. However, because harmful language is so interwoven into language we commonly use now, we can unintentionally cause harm and reinforce harmful stereotypes. There are 2 ways people can refer to those with disabilities. The first being people with disabilities, which is person first and more common in countries like the United States, and disabled people, which is identity first and more common in countries such as Britain. This is also more in line with the social model of disability. Both terms can be used and are acceptable, but the best practice is to ask which term an individual prefers. When we look at language, some examples of harmful language that should not be used includes differently abled, which can cause harm as it can be condescending. The use of suffering from is also harmful as it perpetuates negative stereotypes and can inaccurately make neurodivergent individuals appear as victims. Myths about neurodiversity. Next, we'll go over a few myths about neurodiversity and the neurodiversity movement. The first is neurodiversity is not real. This is untrue. Neurodiversity means diversity in the mind and the brain, which becomes a biological fact. Many people may have opinions or stereotypes about neurodiversity, but that is not what neurodiversity is. Neurodiversity is only about autism. This is untrue. Even though the term was founded by someone who is autistic, the term's use and definitions have grown. And going back to the definition of diversity of brains and minds, neurodiversity can be used in relation to autism and learning disorders as well. The next statement is, the neurodiversity movement does not consider disabilities among people who are neurodivergent. This myth is inaccurate. If we were to look at the social model of disability, it prescribes that disability is prevalent when society is not accessible to their needs. Therefore, neurodiversity can be a disability as society is structured around the needs of neurotypical people. Finally, the neurodiversity movement is against medical interventions or therapy. This is untrue. While the aim of the movement is to understand, accept, and work towards accessibility for neurodivergent individuals, there are therapies and medical interventions that have been shown to be helpful. While applied behavioral analysis, or ABA therapy, is a form of therapy that is harmful as it works on curing neurodiversity, some therapies and medical interventions that focus on providing people with tools and replacement behaviors to help with being overwhelmed or the difficulties that do come from neurodiversity have been shown to be helpful. Coping with neurodiversity. There are a few ways to cope, and on the slide we will discuss a few methods used by neurodivergent individuals. The first is use a checklist. A suggested technique is to create a list to be completed in a certain order in terms of priority. Even if unmotivated to complete tasks, this will help provide the opportunity to see what needs to be done and by when. Important to remember is you cannot control the environment or situations, only how you react to them. It's significant to remember that everyone is doing the best that they can at any given moment. It may be difficult to control a reaction, but if feeling overwhelmed, it can be helpful to separate yourself from an environment or a situation. Finally, breathing. Breathing can be helpful to calm yourself. It can also give you space to collect your thoughts and determine your needs. Next, we'll discuss coping with sensory overload. The first tip is to learn triggers. There may be certain sounds, textures, or smells that trigger sensory overload, but by learning what they are, you can prepare to cope with them when in contact with a trigger. Make plans. Make plans before leaving to go somewhere so that you can prepare for the potential to get overwhelmed, and you can know what to do at that point. For example, if you're going to a party, it might be helpful to prepare where you can go if you start to get overwhelmed. Finally, rest. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed because of sensory overload, take the time to rest. Support tips for parents. Most important to support a child is to listen, validate, and empathize. We'll spend a couple minutes going over this. The first point was listen. It can be an automatic thought to try and help by problem solving, but this can do more harm than good in certain situations. Therefore, the most important thing to do is to listen to a child and see what their needs are at the moment. Once they've shared their needs, next steps can be taken to find ways to help. Validate. Often it may be difficult for a child to vocalize how they're feeling. However, sometimes having someone say that they understand can help, as they won't feel as alone in their emotions. It can also be important to understand from their perspective, as people who are neurodivergent often have strong feelings during different times, such as when their routine is changed. By seeing situations from their perspective, you can better understand how they are feeling and show compassion. Empathize. Empathy normalizes situations and feelings. It will also assist in making them feel less alone. People who are neurodivergent, such as those who have autism, tend to feel emotionally isolated from people, thinking that no one understands what they're feeling. By empathizing, however, it can provide reassurance that you understand or are trying to understand their feelings, and this can provide support. With these main points in mind, it's important to now discuss that it's significant to avoid providing advice that may not be as helpful. Rather than problem solving, focus on listening, validating, and empathizing. It often results in a child reaching out and sharing more, but can also improve relationships with the child. Now we'll go over what's important in supporting a child in the context of COVID-19. With the pandemic, staying at home has had its benefits due to less of a need for socializing and less sensory overload for neurodivergent children. However, changes in routines and uncertainties that come from a pandemic can cause other stressors. It can be very important in a pandemic that has so many uncertainties to focus on listening, validating, and empathizing, as well as providing any supports that are needed. Finally, we'll discuss supporting through self-care. It's also important to look after yourself. Taking care of yourself and your needs become important, especially during a pandemic, as there are multiple stressors. It's also important to be compassionate with yourself. We discussed having compassion for your child, but this is equally as important as having compassion for your own feelings and doubts. Supporting a client. Earlier we discussed briefly ABA therapy and how it has caused harm to people who are neurodivergent, as it was seen as a way to fix, while in reality it only caused harm. Also, we discussed the social model, which prescribes that disability is prevalent when society is not accessible to their needs, and the medical model, which focuses on fixing and disabilities, which ABA therapy is based on. However, this teaches an important lesson, as we can now discuss how for social workers and therapists, practice and support for neurodivergent people should not be focused on fixing, but supporting a client in their needs. Therefore, to best support a client, it's important to focus on support. not fixing. It's also important to provide tools to a client that will help them with things such as sensory overload and symptoms. As well, it should focus on the wants and needs of the client. This is important as it creates space for self-determination. Finally, it's important to listen, validate, and empathize. Supporting a client can be best given by listening to individual needs, validating feelings, and empathizing to normalize feelings. Rather than leaping to problem solving, provide clients with tools to cope with the challenges that neurodiversity brings and how to cope with sensory overload. Neurodiversity and strengths. There are various strengths that neurodiverse people possess, and we'll end the video discussing some of them and what neurodivergent people say their strengths are. The first is understanding where strengths are. People who are neurodivergent often can pick up on their strengths a lot easier, as they've had to cope in certain spaces and make certain experiences work for them. There's also diversity in thinking. As people who are neurodivergent think and see the world differently than someone who's neurotypical, they often bring unique perspectives and views that add critical value to conversations. This is also helpful for finding creative solutions and ideas. Many say that they have the ability to take in a lot of information. They also listen well, and because of this, it makes it easier to take in different information from different sources. Social justice and equity. Many people who are neurodivergent have a strong sense of social justice, and along with their empathy, this means that many tend to see inequities and fight for justice. Fighting old ways of thinking. Because people who are neurodivergent think differently, they often challenge the norms and what is seen as the normal way of doing things. This is beneficial as it provides new perspectives and can create new solutions. Further on this point, it adds great value to spaces as there's creativity to thinking and solutions. I've discussed a bit on how people who are neurodivergent think differently, which adds value to conversations and spaces, but through this they also have great imaginations. This leads to excellent creativity and thinking, which many say can be a major strength. Some people who are neurodivergent also say that their greatest strength is to see connections where most people don't. Because of the ability to notice smaller details, many neurodivergent people often can draw connections to things that many neurotypical people miss. Next, we'll go over some resources. The most important thing to take away from this video is that there is help and supports available. For an immediate mental health crisis, reach out to a crisis line for support. For a non-immediate mental health crisis, a useful resource is For a Safer Space. For a Safer Space is a non-profit that offers accessible and inclusive mental health care. Visit the website for more information if you would like to reach out for support. We'll conclude this video with some important points to remember, the first being that neurodiversity refers to the concept that certain developmental disorders are normal variations in the brain, and these features have certain strengths. There are various warning signs that can be noticed in children under 2 years old as well as older children and adults. ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders, and there are 3 types: predominantly inattentive presentation, predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, and combined presentation. Autism spectrum disorder exists on a wide spectrum and can cause significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges. Learning disabilities are not the same as having ADHD or ASD. However, they do fall under the same category of being neurodivergent. People who are neurodivergent may have sensory processing difficulties, and there are 2 types: auditory and visual processing disorder. Intersectionality is an important aspect of disability studies and is used as an analytical tool to bridge and build upon different connections. To continue with important points to remember, there are 2 models of disability: the medical model, which can cause harm as it focuses on what is perceived as wrong, and the social model, which focuses on the inaccessibility of society. Language plays an important role in perpetuating stereotypes or deconstructing and challenging them. There are various myths about neurodiversity which are inaccurate and can perpetuate stereotypes. There are ways to cope with the challenges of neurodiversity and sensory overload. There are also ways for parents to support their neurodivergent children, especially during the pandemic, but it's also important to look after their own needs. There are ways for practitioners to best support their clients, and neurodiversity comes with great strengths that add value to society. That concludes this presentation on neurodiversity. Thank you for watching.